Hello, U.S. History students, and welcome to our discussion on the Constitutional Convention. Before we get into our in-depth discussion, I want to show you a quick video. It is not a parody video. That'll give you a little bit of better background understanding of what the convention was and why we needed it.
May 1787, Philadelphia. It's now or never for the anything but United States of America. If they don't come up with a constitution to establish a functioning central government, the new nation will most certainly implode. The states send 55 delegates to a constitutional convention to repair the woefully inadequate Articles of Confederation.
There are all kinds of questions about what's going to be the direction for this new nation. And you can't have 13 different answers. You need to have one answer.
These men are charged with nothing less than devising a whole new system of government. The one thing they can agree on is to keep the proceedings secret to ensure candor and allow a full range of argument. Among the group are both new and old faces, including the most revered man in America.
Washington is the presiding chairman, the president of the Constitutional Convention. His presence is very important for the legitimacy of this new Constitution.
The last thing George Washington wanted to do after 8 grueling years of war was leave his beloved Mount Vernon home. At 55, he is tempted to rest on his laurels, but he is keenly aware that all his efforts could be undone if government doesn't change.
I think Washington is nervous about what's going to happen to the country if they don't have a new form of government. He has a national vision of America. That's why he's important to be in that room.
There are other visions in the room. Alexander Hamilton from New York is a brilliant 32-year-old war veteran and attorney. Benjamin Franklin, the great negotiator, now old, frail, but ever wise and reliable, joins the Pennsylvania delegation. Among the missing are 2 of the Revolution's most forceful voices, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who are serving as foreign ministers in England and France.
Adams and Jefferson just, I think, are frantic with the fact that a new government's being written about and they're not there.
In their place, the man with the plan, the Virginia Plan, is James Madison, a 36-year-old career politician from Virginia. Madison knew this moment would come and has spent years formulating a new governing structure.
So James Madison becomes the father of the Constitution. So going back to the beginning of it, when we first declare independence, we got to have a government. And the type of government that we create is called the Articles of Confederation. They're intentionally weak because we just broke away from Great Britain, who was putting all this stuff on us, these taxes, these laws. They weren't giving us representation. They weren't giving us a choice. And so the Articles of Confederation are intentionally weak to protect the state, to protect the liberties of the people, and give them a sense of having a government without giving them the strict interpretation of what a strong federal government needs to be. However, as we move into this American experiment, the inability of the federal government to tax and to unify the states leads to issues like Shays' Rebellion, where you get all of these issues because the government's saying, well, we need money, so we're going to tax the farmers, and if the farmers can't pay, we're going to put them in debtor's prison. And then they rebel because they're like, hey, you don't have the ability to tax me. You can't do that. Only my state can. And they barely get away with not actually having a full-blown war again like the Revolution. So in May of 1787, 55 total delegates from all 13 states convene in Philadelphia. And the purpose of this is to discuss ways to strengthen the national government. And their initial goal is to revise the Articles of Confederation, to tweak them, make them a little bit better. But when they sit down to discuss, they realize just how weak they actually are and decide to scrap them entirely and replace them with the Constitution. The Constitution is a really radical shift from the Articles because it gives more power to the national government than it does to the state governments. And this leads us to conflict because in the Articles of Confederation, we've got more of a strong state government. So each state really gets to determine how it governs itself. And in that sense, the states are going to be stronger than the central government, which is what some people want because they fear the government becoming too powerful. The Supremacy Clause in the Constitution establishes the Constitution, or the federal government, federal law, as the supreme law of the land, not the states. And this is important because the states still have their autonomy. They still get to make laws that they feel as though are going to benefit their citizens. However, those state laws cannot contradict federal law under the Constitution. The national government under the Constitution also has new features. For example, under the Articles of Confederation, there is no executive branch. There is no judicial branch. So we have no one supreme leader, nor do we have a court system that is going to offer interpretation of the overarching document. So rather than having a single unicameral Congress, one branch, under the Constitution, we are divided equally amongst three branches: the executive, which is the presidency, the legislative, which is the lawmaking branch, and the judicial, which is the law interpreting branch. Like the Articles of Confederation, Congress has a legislative branch to make the laws. That stays the same. However, under the Constitution, Congress also has not only the power to tax, which is very important because that's how a country gets its money, but it also has the ability to make money or coin money. Because back then, paper money was not as much of a thing as it is now. Unlike the Articles of the Confederation, the new government also has a court system, or the judicial branch. And the purpose of this branch is to interpret the laws. So to say whether a new law that's proposed is okay and follows the guidelines of laws under the Constitution, or completely contradicts the Constitution and must be redone. They can also prosecute federal crimes, but the main thing that the judicial branch does is interpret laws under the Constitution and determines whether the Constitution says you can do this. Also, unlike the Articles of Confederation, the new government has a president or an executive branch to lead the nation and enforce the laws passed by Congress. And this was a big discussion during the convention because some people saw it as, oh, well, if we have one person as our executor, then what if that person ends up being like a monarch? Which is one thing that Alexander Hamilton proposed, is we should have one person, one president, and that person should be voted in by unanimous vote or by majority vote. And that person should serve for life unless they do something bad, and then they can be impeached or recalled. A lot of people are like, no, that's like a monarchy. That's not going to work because, like, we just broke away from that. So Ben Franklin proposes, okay, well, instead of having a single president, maybe we can have a committee of 3 presidents so that no one person has all the power. And again, well, they didn't really like that idea because then you don't have one person. What if they can't agree? And so they did decide on having a single person as the president. And under the original Constitution, that president doesn't actually have any term limits. So in 1787, when the Constitution's proposed, technically that president could lead for life as long as they are continuously re-elected. And under Article 2 of the Constitution, they outline everything that needs to be done as far as how to elect a president, what the president should do, what their job is essentially, and who can be a president. In Section 1, Article 2, it says, "No person except a natural-born citizen or citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible to the office of president, neither shall any person be eligible to that office who shall not have attained the age of 35 years and been 14 years a resident within the United States." Delegates of the Constitutional Convention agree on some really major philosophical ideas for the new national government. One of these is popular sovereignty. The people have the power by voting for leaders. This is extremely important because it gives more power to the citizens than strictly to the government. And if those people don't like the leaders that they are electing, they can remove them from office by recall vote, voting to remove them. Limited government is another one that they put in place. Even though the national government was stronger, the citizens' liberties were still protected. And this is where a lot of them wanted a Bill of Rights or amendments to the Constitution. An amendment is simply a change. But we'll get more into that in our discussion over the Constitution and its ratification. And the third major thing is federalism. The national government will share the power with the states. So even though the federal government's the overarching government, the power does also still lie in the state governments because the states know better what their citizens need. So, for example, if you're living in Texas, your state government in Austin is going to better understand what you need than some guy sitting up in Washington, D.C., 1,000 miles away. And so how this works out is the national government regulates foreign and interstate commerce. They provide a national form of currency because prior to this, each state had its own currency. So you would have to exchange your money every time you cross state borders. They can provide an army and a navy. They have the power to declare war, establishing the federal courts below the Supreme Court. So there are appellate courts below the Supreme Court. And the federal government has the ability to establish those. They conduct foreign relations, so only the federal government can discuss national business with France, for example. And they can exercise powers implied from the express powers. State governments can regulate intrastate commerce, meaning across state borders or within the state lines. So interstate is from one state to another. Intrastate is within that state's borders. They can establish local governmental systems, so state, local, county, things like that. They have the ability to administer the elections within their states. Even if it's a federal election, they can run that election within their state. and they protect the public's health, welfare, and morals. And this is what I meant by somebody sitting in Austin is going to better know what Texans need than somebody sitting up in Washington, thousands of miles away. Now, both state and national level governments can levy taxes. That's why some states have an income tax, and then their citizens also pay a federal income tax. States can borrow money. They can spend for the general welfare. And under the Constitution, the federal government can also borrow money. They can establish courts, and they can enact and enforce laws. So this is federalism. Federal and state governments working together for the greater good of the citizens. We also create separation of powers. So each branch of the federal government has its own defined powers and their own responsibilities to the people. But also within that, they have checks and balances. So each branch can limit the power of the other. So the courts can interpret congressional statutes and declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. They can also declare presidential actions unconstitutional and determine whether the executive branch is properly administering laws passed by Congress. The president can nominate federal judges and enforce court orders. He can also recommend legislation to Congress, veto bills passed by Congress, which means he can basically say no, and he can implement the laws made by Congress. The legislative branch passes the laws that create executive agencies and programs. It can override presidential vetoes, but only by a 2/3 vote of both chambers, and they can impeach the president. The Senate also ratifies treaties and confirms presidential appointments to executive branches and the courts. So, for example, in 2020, since Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has passed away, the president will nominate a federal judge. The Senate must then in turn approve that executive appointment. Congress can also impeach judges in the Supreme Court. They can create lower federal courts and fix their jurisdictions and set this as the Supreme Court. So under the Constitution, it doesn't blatantly say that the Supreme Court must be made up of 9 justices. The Congress can make the amount of judges that it wants. If it makes more, that's called court packing. You're packing more justices into the court. Most of the time, they will want an odd number of justices as a means of limiting like 4-4 votes or 3-3 votes if they had 6 people. They can also determine judicial salaries. The Senate then also confirms judges, as I noted before. Delegates of the convention had to negotiate a huge series of compromises in order to agree on the framework for government, because you've got 55 people representing 13 states, and many of these compromises deal with how representatives would be chosen from states to serve in Congress. And we call these the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. So the larger states want to add the president to lead the nation in a bicameral Congress in which larger states have more representatives. So they're saying Congress should be composed of 2 houses, which we have, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And they believe that delegates should be assigned based on population. So the larger the state, the more representation they have in Congress. The smaller states are like, whoa, calm down. That's not fair. They believe that 1 house of Congress should be preserved and everybody should be equally represented. That way, even if Virginia has a larger population than New Jersey, they're still going to be equal as far as representation goes. So they're still going to have the same number of votes. That way, no one state is getting more votes than another just because they've got more people. And so the Great Compromise resolves these differences between the large and small states. It creates a bicameral legislature. So we have the House of Representatives and the Senate. Goes kind of along with the Virginia plan. In the Senate, each state has 2 representatives, so it's all equal. And each representative serves a 6-year term. In the House of Representatives, the number of representatives is determined by that state's population. So Texas is going to have more representatives in the House of Representatives than Rhode Island, because we have a larger population. And so this kind of makes everyone happy. Doesn't make everyone happy, but it makes more people happy, because each version of the plan is getting what it wants in one way, shape, or form. Northern and southern states also cannot agree on whether to count slaves towards population size. The southern states that have the larger size of population for slaves are like, yes, please count them. We don't think they're people, but yes, please count them. Because that would give them more votes and therefore more power in the House of Representatives. The smaller states that have smaller populations of slaves are like, that's not fair. You don't think that they're people anyway, so why should you count them in your population? To give you more votes? That's kind of silly. And so we come up with the 3/5 compromise. And while horrible, it allows states to count 3 out of every 5 slaves towards taxation and population size. So, unfortunately, it's very similar to saying that each slave is 3/5 of a person. But 3 out of 5 slaves are then in turn counted for the population. Many Northerners wanted to use the Constitutional Convention to end slavery, but Southerners threatened to leave the U.S. anytime slavery was discussed, and that's why the Constitution really doesn't have a lot to say about slavery, because it was such a controversial discussion, even at that point, that they felt as though they could put it off for a little while and handle it later. So as a compromise for the South, the slave trade could continue for 20 more years. So by 1804, slavery was not allowed to be represented in the District of Columbia anymore. And by 1807, slave trade was not allowed to continue. So we could no longer bring Africans from Africa into the country. Now, that did not ban the sale of slaves within the nation. It just meant that we couldn't bring them from Africa anymore. And runaway slaves would have to be returned to their masters. So if a slave was to leave a plantation, let's say in South Carolina, and they were caught in Pennsylvania, they were required to be returned to their master in South Carolina. So they would be transported back. And the Constitution doesn't really give many guidelines on this. And so slavery ends up being a sore spot in the nation for many more years. And we'll get more into the slavery discussion and sectionalism as we move through that time period in history. But it's important to understand that the Constitution itself, as it's written in 1787, does not directly discuss slavery and what is to be done about it, nor does it abolish the practice. James Madison negotiates and writes much of the framework of the new government and is often referred to as the father of the Constitution. He also becomes our 4th president of the United States after George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. This brings our discussion of the Constitutional Convention to an end. We will next discuss the ratification or the acceptance of the Constitution, and that will be another video. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.